Hello, I want to welcome you all to the German Marshall Fund of the US, those of you in the room and also those of you joining us online. Chairman Warner was here 4 years ago to launch GMF's tech program, and we're so thrilled to have him back. And I just want to take 1 second as my prerogative in welcoming to just highlight the trends that we were seeing then and how they've really erupted and upended the economy and the economic order that we knew then. When you think about COVID and what it revealed about the fragility of our supply chains, the invasion of Ukraine and how it showed the weaponization of our critical technologies, our realization of how China has abused the trading system and hollowed out our manufacturing base, and of course, the need to transition our economy to a clean energy future. And now, of course, the promise and the perils of AI. So we're thrilled to welcome him back. And let me just say why it's so important that we have him here as we continue to chart this roadmap. We really want to, I think we want to have a roadmap that replaces the old system. I think the old system is dead, but it's not clear what's going to replace it. And we need something, of course, that fosters innovation, that fosters democracy, national security, and of course, the climate. And both he and Rana Foroohar have been leading and helping us to craft that roadmap. Chairman Warner specifically has been doing more to shape the US response on these issues than anyone. He started his career in tech. He's a former governor. He began convening classified briefings on China competition as early as 2017. He steered the bipartisan report on Russian interference in the 2016 election and put out the first bipartisan legislation thereafter. He's been building consensus on a US approach on new investments, including the CHIPS Act. And he's now been charting a new approach on AI. So we're really, really lucky to get his thoughts today. And we could have nobody better than Rana Foroohar moderating. Not only is she the global business columnist and associate editor at the FT, CNN global economics analyst, author of 3 books, but please, please, please get her most recent book, Homecoming, and read her recent columns. They're the best guide to what we're now calling Bidenomics, what it's trying to do, where it needs to move next. And I can't recommend it enough. So I'm going to turn it over to Rana. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Thank you, Senator. Such a pleasure. And thanks to everybody for coming to GMF today. We've got 40 minutes or so. We're going to be in discussion, but we're going to save 10 or 15 at the end. So have your questions and there'll be mic runners. Gosh, a lot of topics to cover. Let me start, Senator, with just, the latest news, hackings of Secretary Raimondo's emails. It almost feels like, another day, another hacking crisis. Where are we now with security in general, national security and technology and the nexus of this versus where we were 2 years ago or 4 years ago? And then I want to jump into AI and the crazy landscape.
And I hope we got to talk also about the whole overall tech competition. But let me, first of all, Karen, thank you for having me back. And I know we're at the German Marshall Fund, but I think we should say a big shout out to all of our French friends. Happy Bastille Day. So, we all have a glass of wine on that tonight. And Rana, thank you for, I'm going to echo what Karen said. If you don't read Rana, read her. She has helped me, educate me, and we have had many very engaged conversations on kind of future of work, future capitalism. Yeah. In light of Bastille Day, in terms of your question about the Microsoft hack, I would say, plus ça change, plus la même chose.
Very nice.
Because it feels like we, about every 6 months, have a major hack. And it takes the news for 2 or 3 days. And if we look back just in terms of hacks that we have pinpointed as originating from Russia or China, you got the Microsoft hack. You had years back the OPM hack. You had the Colonial Pipeline hack. You had the Equifax hack. You had, I think it was the Marriott Hotel hack. You had the, I'm having a brain fart, they got into 170,000 companies. So
I mean, it's almost like you
Quickly,
could have a
yeah.
list of 12 of these
Yeah.
that we.
So, and what have we done? Frankly, I think we get better all the time, but only marginally.
Mm,
You know, and there is no single answer. I feel a little bit like a nagging parent on this. You know, the notion that we don't practice good cyber hygiene on an individual basis. You don't click on a link you aren't aware of. Turn your damn phone off once every 24 hours to reset it. If there is an upgrade, use it. And you know, this is a vulnerability. Our Chinese and Russian, whether they be governmental entities or particularly in Russia, you know, spies by day, cyber criminals by night. They have not backed off at all in terms of trying to penetrate our systems. And, you know, we hear about the ones that are made public, but it's a challenge. And the irony is, and I want to, you know, give kudos to Microsoft, because Microsoft has been as forward-leaning as any company leaning in to help our friends in Ukraine in terms of pushing back the Russian cyber attacks. Now, I still believe that we have still not seen that the Russians have not used their most powerful cyber tools against us. I think partially because Ukrainians have been good, but also partially because I think they are afraid about what we could do, cyber escalation. And if you come back then to the American government, and Congress in particular, our response has been fairly pitiful. There are two pieces, let me just quickly, there are two pieces of legislation. I was proud to be part of both of them that have become law, but the implementation of both of these has been, again, and one we got an update as recently as yesterday on. The first one said the federal government, when you purchase IoT connected devices, i.e. sensors and other things, you got to have minimum cyber standards. That's the law of the land. It's been law since I think 2020 or 2021. We got an upgrade. They have made at most incremental progress, which is crazy. Second is, and we passed this in, became law, I believe, last year, which was the cyber incident reporting legislation, which said, all right, not because we want to go out and you'd report to CISA, and Microsoft would of course report, but not because we, you know, want to wrap your knuckles if you've been penetrated, but, you know, 85 to 90% of our networks are in private sector hands. And if you can tell CISA, which is not a regulatory entity, and they can notify the balance of private sector partners to make sure this is how the bad guys got in this company X, we passed the law, but some in the business community were so reluctant to have it implemented. We've got a 5-year implementation schedule on. That's crazy. And to the point, just to bring it home, is that, you know, we all saw the ramifications of the Colonial Pipeline, and thank goodness we were able to go back and grab some of the money back. But it caused literally a gas shortage for a while on the East Coast and places like Virginia. But what people don't realize is there was another pipeline hack about the same time, and that company never reported to the government.
Okay, you are drawing together so many interesting things right now. I want to connect some of these dots and push you forward. You're talking about incremental change, getting incrementally better, you know, episode by episode. We're dealing really in technology and in geopolitics with a paradigm change. In technology, we're dealing with AI, which I want to ask about, you know, where that's going. You've been digging deep into that. But we're also dealing with the rise of China, the end of the neoliberal model, the conventional globalization model, a more acknowledgement, I think, that we're dealing with state actors as you know, that are not coming into the Bretton Woods system seamlessly. All of that is paradigm level shifts. How do we even begin? I mean, you're talking about, we've got this bit of legislation, that bit of legislation. We've got one company reporting, another company not reporting. How do we start dealing with this in America?
Well, on this one on a macro level, I think whether it's been fully articulated or not, that we're making some progress. You know, I feel like my job as chairman of the Intelligence Committee, if I got one passion as kind of a tech geek, is to try to change the definition of national security. National security in 2023 regardless of what's happening in Russia, Ukraine, is very different than it was in 2013 or 2003, or even I would argue as different as it was in 2018, 2019. And a lot of that is due to competition with China. And when I say China, I think it is absolutely critical to make the point as a policymaker, my beef is not with the Chinese people, it is not with the Chinese diaspora, it is with the authoritarian regime of Xi Jinping and the CCP. But we have, when we faced off against the Soviet Union, it was a military threat and a ideological threat. China is an economic rival, and in some areas may be passing the United States in technology domination. What drove this point home to me in many ways, I was a wireless guy, was 6 or 7 years ago, when not only did China have the premier 5G wireless company in terms of Huawei, but the fact that, and this is one of the things that we'd kind of, I think, America in particular had always expected almost by right, that even if we didn't invent the technology, we would get to set the standards, protocols, systems, rules for that technology development. And that was an enormously powerful effort, because you could build in our values, you could build in our systems, you could build in transparency. China was starting to run the table not only on Huawei, but also setting the rules and regulations. I think it was a wake-up call. And I would argue, while we've not, even around the question, say, for example, of industrial policy, we, which used to be kind of a bad word, many of my Republican partners who didn't like the term foreign industrial policy are now embracing the fact that in this competition, it's going to require government investment. And I think we actually have three models that we've not called out, but I do think it is three models of how we help take on this competition. One, the most kind of traditional, obvious, is the CHIPS bill. And I was proud to be, along with John Cornyn, the author of that bill. And, it's kind of traditional, $52 billion and then another $25 billion of investment tax credits, $40 billion to Fed, billion or so to R&D and workforce and other issues. And boy, I'm a big fan of Gina Raimondo, but we got to implement that correctly. We'll never do it again. So CHIPS would be number one. Number two was direct appropriation, model one. Model two was using the tax code, the Inflation Reduction Act on the energy side. This has pushed more capital than I think even its biggest proponents would have argued. And we are close to, not literally hundreds and hundreds of billions on a path to $1 trillion of investment driven by tax code changes. And then the third, and there's not many places I'm going to give President Trump credit, but the third model, which was a pretty darn good model, was government as the ultimate purchaser by saying, okay, private sector, you go out and figure out a COVID vaccine, and we'll guarantee that we'll buy a bunch of them. And so we've got those three models out there. All of them require some level of public-private collaboration, but I think we are going to have to, and we'll get to AI, but I think we may have to do this in quantum. We may have to, I would argue we need to do this in advanced energy. As long as we call it advanced energy and not green energy, I can get total support. I think we need to do it in synthetic biology.
That's an interesting
I think we need to, we may or may not need to do it in AI, but this level of technology competition, I think, is the issue of our time. Because I did a forum with Marco Rubio, my vice chair, yesterday in front of all the Intel community, INSA, and he's a believer that Xi will move militarily or some action on China within the decade. I think he will move in some way, whether it be blockade or elsewhere. But I, frankly, am less worried about a repeat of what's happening in terms of the traditional, almost World War I tactics that's taking place in Russia and Ukraine. But think that conflict with China will be who can take down somebody's overhead system, who can knock out your GPS system.
100%,
if you dominate fusion and SMRs, and you've signed up 50 nation states to buy energy supply from you that's not oil related, you can run the table.
Again, I want to connect some of the dots here. Really important stuff. What you're talking about with China, say, starting to dominate standard setting, thus starting to dominate certain supply chains and production and supply. These are things that are long term. They've been decades in the making. They've been happening for a while. The industrial policy that China has is a very, like it or not, and whether it's effective or not, and we can argue that, it's a very 360 connected top-down strategy. You talked about the CHIPS Act. There's been a lot of complaint from business about just about the export restrictions and the CHIPS Act and how it's rolling out in general. There's going to be more as we have to start to think about greater aspects of the supply chain, because it's not enough to just put a foundry in place, right? You've got to start to think about, as you mentioned, IoT, Internet of Things, additives, sensors, quantum. Do we have not the institutions, but the capacity in terms of how we are regulating, thinking, connecting the dots to address these issues? I know that's
I can spend the whole, you and I have spent a bunch of time in the past, and I won't go down this rabbit hole, but I'll just put a marker down. The approach that we took in this country on social media, which was, all right, you guys go out and break things and we'll figure out the rules after the fact, I think it was a complete disaster. And we've ceded that now to the Europeans for the rules. The fact we don't have a privacy legislation. I want to thank Karen for the support on some of our Section 230 reform. The fact that we don't have kids online safety. I mean, we don't even have data portability and interoperability. And it kind of, as we still grab our arms around that, and then again, some of you have been helpful, and I want to thank you as well. As there's a series of approaches, but we have an approach on how you deal with not just TikTok, but TikTok, Huawei, technology companies from nation states that we define by law as adversarial, China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, Cuba, Venezuela. There needs to be a regulatory framework. And we were making huge progress on that. 26 senators, it was 2-by-2, Democrat, Republican, the administration has signed on. TikTok then dropped $100 million in lobbying, and some of them are attacked from the left and right. No, we're back and we're working. But it's almost like if we can't deal with something where 150 million Americans are having their data taken, and you have the most powerful misinformation, disinformation tool ever in terms of the ability to know what you like before you like it, and don't think for a moment that the CCP in a moment of conflict would not shade its messaging.
Yeah.
And and I think there's great things, great creativity on TikTok. Great thing that social influencers make their money, have at it. I just would rather it doesn't have to be an American company. It could be a Brazilian company, it could be an Indian company. But I mentioned that because when we think about how we come to something like, if we can't even get there, how are we going to put some guardrails on AI? And when you go to supply chain, two or three quick points. One, we did one of the things that now has been made public. We started on a bipartisan basis in 2017. Doing what we call classified roadshow. Glenn remembers this when he was working inside NSA. We would bring always a bipartisan group of senators, FBI, Director of National Intelligence Office, CISA, others, and by industry sector, basically come in and say, hey, here's what you got to be concerned about in China. And let me be clear, I changed my view. I was all in on China into the world order. I led trade missions. I think there was a fundamental shift when Xi decided in 2014 that maintenance of the CCP power and authority was more important than, frankly, even China's further economic gain. So we started in 2017 because I was hearing all these things in the intel space, $500 billion a year of intellectual property theft. Yet all my friends in business and academia were saying, this is the future we're going to, and frankly, some of our businesses would turn a blind eye to the intellectual property theft or the treatment of the Uyghurs, the treatment of the people in Hong Kong, because it's such a big market. We can't bring our moral compass. But we had like 17 of these sessions, and there was some eye rolling at first. I think we got along. Matter of fact, one of the things that really frustrated me was pre-COVID, private equity in America would not even take a brief because they were so invested in name your company, Alibaba, Baidu, Tencent, ByteDance. They didn't want to hear what we would share with them in a classified setting. Now, post-COVID, private equity is in the game. Everybody, I think, has understood that. They've seen how Xi approached in the Chinese people during COVID. They've seen the Belt and Road sputter a little bit, but so we have to keep educating American and people, business, academia. Not that we need a decoupling, but that we do need to start making these supply chains more secure. Last point I'll make on this is just that and I think we've made huge progress, but literally within the last 3 months, there was a Fortune 50 CEO in one of these classified settings. I won't call it my Republican colleague in there, and they're going, "Come on, guys, you don't really think she's going to do anything with Taiwan?" And I'm like going, "What planet do you live on?"
Yeah.
And if you don't, I hope it doesn't happen. But if you don't have a plan B, if you don't think, and maybe in light of what's happened recently in Russia, this is a less of a concern today than it was 2 months ago. If you don't think America and our friends will react if she starts sending artillery shells to Putin, then you're not a very good CEO, or you're not appropriately measuring business risk. So we're still got a lot of ways to go. And on the legislative front, we've done bits and pieces. We've tried to put in some of these rules to bring stuff back. The IRA did a lot in the energy space, but the fact that we've not done much more in healthcare, for example, is on APIs is huge.
Wow. Okay. Well, we can keep going on just the politics of this and the economics of it in the U.S. for some time, but this is a German Marshall Fund. So I actually want to bring in Germany. Germany's in an interesting place, as is Europe in general. They do a lot of business with China. They're very stressed about the idea of a kind of a two systems technology paradigm. I think there's a strong argument. I think many Europeans and people around the world think there's a strong argument for more resiliency and diversity in things like chips, in things like critical minerals, which, you're already seeing triple-digit inflation because there's a 4% shortage. You can make a strong economic case for this, but again, it's a paradigm shift. And the Europeans, at the same time that they're worried about losing business in China, they're also worried that, say, American big tech is going to end up dominating the IoT space, the data space, hurt their white goods companies. Maybe they won't be able to develop their own startups. That's a lot to bridge, but how do you think about that?
I will give you a couple of data points. One, Goldman Sachs will have me sometimes come and talk to all their German clients. Pre-COVID, I did a non-classified presentation about the challenge with China, and I got some head nods, but some eye rolls. Post-COVID, same business leaders, they were all in. Number one. Number two, what helped? One of the dirty little secrets about how the CHIPS bill got passed, because there was some dawdling, and frankly, from the House, even with the Democratic control. The fact that the Europeans, and Germany in particular, moved quicker to give 8 billion euro to Intel to build a large fab in Germany, and I could go to my friends and say, when the Europeans, and I love our European friends, when the Europeans' bureaucracy moves faster than the Americans, we got to get our stuff together.
Yikes, yeah.
And that was literally within 2 weeks, we passed the bill and got it to the president's desk.
Yeah.
So I think, and you look at what the Italians have done, there are huge investments in trying to reshoring chips. Three, if you look at what we've done in terms of the tools and chips, what the Dutch have done with ASML and some of the other supply chain entities, I think people are coming along. And you're starting to see German and other European countries move out of some of the China operations. One of the things we need to do, though, and I think this from a macro standpoint, is that because I do think there's a lot of countries that may have received Belt and Road initiatives from China, but they then didn't get the jobs because the Chinese imported their own workforce. The product was pretty crummy, and they're deep in debt to an entity that may not even, as bad as the Americans may be, we're a little more forgiving than where the Chinese are. But I think we make a huge policy mistake every time we talk about this as America and NATO or America and the West, because we frankly piss off 2/3 of the rest of the world that would like to be engaged with that. Well, I think South America, Africa, I'm proud to be the chair of the India caucus, the balance of countries in Asia. Engagement with them, that's an awful lot of markets. For German cars and manufacturing, where Germany is going to continue to be a world leader. And that, it was almost, even what the phraseology, it was almost easier. You're not old enough, but it was like the, communists in the free world, it was like there was at least nomenclature on how we describe it. So how we talk about the authoritarian world versus the non-authoritarian world. We need even some branding still here. But I think and I do think our friends in Europe, I've found on my trips, and not just, I think about my trip recently to Finland and Turkey, and at least behind closed doors, there is real
Really? That's
understanding
interesting.
of the concern.
Okay, and on the, I mean, how would you, I want to ask you one more question on that. How would you then react to the European outrage over the IRA, which in a way, it's sort of, I mean, I have to say, as an American working for a British publication, I'm like, wait a minute, you've been telling us we need to do something around clean energy for years. We're doing it, but what do you make of that? How do you?
Gosh, why don't you kind of said it? I said it, but no, and I think Europeans need to do their own. Now, there ought to be some.
Yeah.
And I think we've seen some movement on how we redefine who, allies in the supply chain. You're not going to bring every one of these jobs back to America. And even the authors of the IRA,
Sure.
I've had lots of conversations with Joe on this. There are so many different technology domains where the innovation combined with our friends around the world. I mean, one in particular is an old, telecom guy, Open Radio Access Network, ORANs, which are more software based. And this, I wish would have happened with the Modi visit. Our best ally there is going to be India, because you're going to move from a hardware based approach to a software based approach. You got an awful lot of really smart software engineers in India. So, this is not an America only effort.
But it needs to be, this goes to the point about industrial policy, which is ultimately about sort of connecting the well-being of the nation state with the well-being of the world. We're not just signing some deals right now, but getting into conversations with India, with Germany, with Brussels, that don't necessarily have exactly the same set of standards, right? So you've got higher or lower labor standards in some deals. You've got the Europeans, okay, maybe they're building more chips now, but they're still using Chinese software in their ports, and they have no idea, necessarily what it's doing. If in your dream world, should there be a new regulatory body that brings all this together? Should there be a resiliency czar in the White House? Like, what would do it?
I know this White House hates using the term czar,
I
but
know,
having somebody
nomenclature,
overseeing resiliency makes some sense. Although I wish our classified roadshows, and maybe it ought to not be Americans, we ought to do a classified set of roadshow briefings in every capital in Europe, and frankly educate, because if you can show the challenge, and I think people will get it. I mean, if you look at the number of countries, and we did a crappy job at first on trying to make the case about Huawei, but if you look at the number of European countries that have said, well, maybe this Huawei stuff with backdoors is a problem. And the challenge again on a lot of these issues is not that it is happening real time, but the potential when you have an upgrade to manipulate and capture your data information. I think the Huawei case is a precursor of a lot of other examples, but we've got to be willing to share that information. One of the things we did do a good job, and particularly the Americans and the Brits, and I remember the week being in Munich the week before the Ukraine war started, and the head of the German spy services was, well, Mark, I kind of see, but I don't really think Putin's going to go in that way. The fact that we were as forward-leaning, Americans and Brits, in terms of saying, here's what they're going to do, here's how they're going to have a coup, it really put the Russians off guard. In this newer world, the American intelligence community, which does a damn good job, needs to be more sharing, and we share with the services. And I think there are very few, and I think even the German service understood the challenge, but we got to be willing to declassify more information to make the case in a stronger way to the business and the people of these nation states.
Let me, before we open it up for questions for 5 or 10 minutes, I want to draw you out on AI. You've been going really deep on this. Is it all that? Is it more than that? How worried should we be or not? And I want to go to what the opportunity could be as well.
There are opportunities. Nothing has been as humbling to me as I tried to learn AI, because for every 2 hours I spend or 4 hours I spend, I am spending 10 or 15 hours a week. I maybe move forward on 2 things, but have to rethink at least one of my premises. And let me, I shared with you, I'll do the quickie version. A year ago at this point, I thought that AI was simply a great branding term for advanced statistics. and it'd been around since the 80s, and this was finally going to come. Starting in the fall, and after spending a lot of time with people like Sam Altman and a whole bunch of others, I moved from this advanced statistics to holy heck. This is the biggest innovation in our lifetime, bigger than the internet, bigger than the wireless revolution, you name it. And the premise and the operating premise last fall and as early as even the beginning of this year was, okay, on a national security basis, we have to be concerned with China because China has the ability to amass amazing amounts of data. You think about all these great Chinese tech companies that will aggregate that data to the CCP. You got to have who's got the most compute power, who's got the most money, who's got the most ability to train that data, who's got smart people. And the scale that China could bring to this task was like, holy heck, we got to be careful. And on the non-China basis, the two leading players, OpenAI/Microsoft or Anthropic/Google, they made basically the same case. We're going to win because we got the most money, we got the most compute, we got the most smart people. And that was the kind of, and a gating factor would be, unless you got $1 billion or a couple $1 billion, don't even get in the game. So, you may have, Amazon get in the game. There may be some other entity, Meta, whether they leaked or it not, their Llama system that kind of got the whole battle of open versus closed systems. Then starting about March, people started to change their case, I would argue, on kind of writ large, from we're going to have one default large language model to no, we're going to have 4 or 5, and they can kind of compete. And then we will, by industry sector, bolt on applications that will still be connected to this, kind of mothership. Then, pick your time, April, May, and this is happening so real time. That whole model gets turned on its head when suddenly UAE, for tens of millions of dollars, has got a huge system. Or France, where the Meta, interesting, a lot of the Meta researchers were French, and French has now become an AI powerhouse. And a whole set of entities are suddenly saying, we don't even need to attach to a large language model. There is not this gating requirement of a big, and you can create a model. And I'm still not sure, I had somebody pitching me the other day on all the stuff they call AI that they would have simply called increased compute ability 2 years ago. And I shared with you, I had, some of our leading figures in a classified briefing, I won't identify obviously, but saying, well, maybe this is just all advanced statistics again. So I still believe, and as we think about how do we put some guardrails around this, how do we, if you just look at the economic model, how do we keep up if the model of saying you need $1 billion to have table stakes to come to the game has suddenly changed to, well, I'm going to build off a open sourced large language model that's already out in the wild, and I can build something on that for, double-digit $1 million. That's how do we regulate that? Think about that framework. And so I think we need to focus. I do think there are the downsides, which we all know, data bias, hallucination, which frankly is bad answers. It is part of I think it is built in, and you can get some of that with training, sourcing of data, the watermark. There are a huge set of problems, but I'm still having enough of a problem. And I can tell you inside the US government, whether it's on the defense, intel, or overall operations side, we don't even have a common definition.
That's interesting. So, I was going to ask you, are we going to see legislation around AI by the end of the year? Or not? It sounds.
I think if we don't have at least a framework, we are going to miss the opportunity. The Europeans already have a framework, frankly, and for Chinese domestic use of AI, I don't agree with all of it, but they have thought through a set of rules. Again, I don't agree with on a lot of things. Part of their thing is making sure that Chinese people can't, ask a large language model about Tiananmen Square and stuff, but I would hope from a value standpoint, from a safety standpoint, from a protection of intellectual content standpoint, that we're in the game. And that doesn't mean it's going to have to be fully thought through. I would argue if we have the two areas that I think there is some possibility, and I would say I've never been on any issue that is at this moment in time as broadly bipartisan. I've been hosting a series of these groups, all with total bipartisans that I've seen virtually no divide on a partisan basis. One is, at least on the large language models, trying to build in security. You know, the thing is, these entities are racing each other so much that I think they are, again, missing building in security. And it goes back to our first question of how do we stop, you know, the Microsoft or whichever hack coming out, build that in rather than trying to bolt it on later. Or the second, where, and I've had even a lot of my Republican colleagues say this, is say, gosh, I don't know how we do this. And I know it's an anathema to think about a new government agency, but maybe there needs to be a independent AI entity that then would interface with the FAA or the FCC or the FDA or, you know, all of our, because I don't know how you build in a field that's moved this quickly over just the last 9 months from what it is to the economics, how you build that skill set in at each of our respective, you know,
That's
regulatory
really
areas.
interesting. I have about 1,000 more questions, but I want to open it up and give people a chance. I think we've got mic. Do we have mic runners? Okay. And do you want people to come to the mic, or are you going to take it?
Yeah, mic will come to you.
Okay, so let's start here.
Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you very much for your time here. Ansgar Baums of German Marshall Fund. Have two questions. One is, where do you see gaps in the current regulatory geotech stack that the US has built over the last years? We hear that there's something more coming on cloud. What else is there that needs to be regulated, where you see it? There are now the controls in place that the US would need in order to confront China. And secondly, Jake Sullivan talked about the international alignment structure that needs to be built, and he talked about it's more like Gary than the Parthenon. So seems to be a wild mix of tools, bilateral tools, and plurilateral. I don't know what. What are your ideas on how the international alignment structure of the West would look like?
Again, let's not call it the West. Let's call it the non-authoritarian nations. You know, I do think one of the things that we've seen is that Russia or China, the ability to use the cloud to get around existing restrictions on transactions is, you know, is something where there's a problem, and since there still is consensus, and frankly, while there's disagreement, I still think there's an overwhelming majority that supports Ukraine. You know, on China, there is virtual, if not unanimous, 95% plus. Matter of fact, there are some people who can outbash China the most, which I think is not that helpful. So I do think the area around, you know, there are gaps around cloud. You know, there are a number of people who are proponing, you know, we've got a CFIUS process that frankly is okay, but doesn't hit, you require a transaction. Why I think, you know, whether our approach, which is called the Restrict Act, which gives commerce a process. You got to give, you know, the Russian Kaspersky company or the Chinese Huawei company or TikTok, you got to give them a day in court. There just needs to be a set of rules. And again, point to, you know, the number of nation states that have, for example, on TikTok, that have at least banned it from their government phones. India's banned it from personal use. And, you know, the Brits even went ahead and told the BBC, or the BBC on its own said, don't use it. There's advocates around a broader based export control system. You know, I think we have to, I'm open, but I think we have to tread lightly. Some of those things you don't want to, I don't think you can cut off all exchange. And then on the overall tech stack, I again come back to, you know, European Union. I've met with the folks who are leading the regulatory effort there. It's just going to be a lot better if we could do this in concert. And you know, and there are things, I mean, and there are already differences. My understanding, you've got, for example, in the EU, lots of interest in protecting, for example, the intellectual product content copyright. Because I had somebody come to me, why would I ever, that was publisher of the Food and Wine and Bon Appetit, and say, why would I ever put any more money into those if that data is going to get scraped into a large language model? And you say, make me the best, you know, German strudels possible, and you don't know where they came from, Bon Appetit or Betty Crocker or Julia Child, But on the other hand, my understanding, and this I could be wrong on, but that the Japanese have a totally different approach on. So I think there are a series of areas here where we need to sort this out. We don't have I'm not sure what the forum is. The idea of an entity that would take on some of this. I do think one of the things that the Americans in particular were so used to setting all the standards, and that we stopped sending people to the international standard setting entities. Businesses stopped sending people. China would flood the zone, and in many of these standard setting bodies, who shows up gets to set the rules. I think we're starting to turn that around, but I'll give you an example of the craziness of this. American tax law. If you send an engineer to a standard setting body that meets in the United States, you can totally write off the expenses of that engineer, even if they're a standard setting body for a period of time. If it happens to be in the Philippines or in Milan, you don't get the same tax treatment. So small companies don't send their engineers.
That's such a great example. Question here.
Senator, thanks for the opportunity. Dave Sustainer from your Asia group. The question I had for you is what potential models would look like from an American perspective? So you described, stringent Chinese model, they're doing the licensing regime, the risk-based model in Europe. Any hypothesis on what the right balance is from an AI regulatory perspective of what a US comprehensive model would be? And then similarly, at a global governance level, what's a model that you think makes sense to patch kind of a regulatory patchwork at a global level?
I take them in reverse order and great questions. And part of this, the first question, I'm not sure I got a great answer, so I'll be a good politician to answer the part that I would know. On the regulatory body, I think we need to acknowledge, and this is again something that I got educated on, the notion of setting cyber standards. There was an international effort the UN was going to lead in the late 90s. And like that would have maybe said, you can hack somebody, but if you hack a hospital system, we're going to have lower attribution rules to go after you. It was actually in the United States, and Russia and China wanted to participate in that. The United States felt we were so ahead on cyber at that point that we didn't want to participate. So what is the right forum? And frankly, the UN's got exponentially greater problems today and less credibility today than it had in the 90s. I think we need that international forum, and there is at this point, I think, a justifiable sense that if Russia and China participate, will they follow the rules that are set out? I think that's a jump ball question, but how we get the balance, the world around an AI structure that at least, I think there's common agreement. Security, I think there's some common agreement that we need flexible expertise by sector, but at least something in terms of veracity of data, the watermarking or some process so that you can have some sense of knowing whether this is true or not true, or was it at least trained on real information? But I'm wide open for you and Ian and others to educate me on what that forum ought to be. And I'm going to, I am not yet at the stage of saying, prescriptive China versus risk-based European. But I hope to be, and I'm welcoming you. Listen, me and Sean, where's Sean from my office? We are wide open for being educated. And so if you guys have got views and thoughts.
Good to call. Question here.
Thank you very much. I'm Charlie Parton. As you can hear from my accent, I'm British, but I was a diplomat for many, many years with both the British and the European Union. So first of all, thank you very much for a very cogent exposition, and a bigger thank as a Brit to you and Americans who've stopped Huawei in our country, because we weren't going to get that. You mentioned Huawei, you mentioned TikTok, you could have mentioned Hikvision, you could have mentioned any number, but it seems to me that this is playing whack-a-mole, and that what we really need to do.
Have you read all my earlier press releases? Because that's what I call our system.
I have read a few, but we really need to be more systemic and generic about it. And to me, the biggest threat by far than Huawei or TikTok is cellular Internet of Things modules, and companies like Quectel and Fibercom, which the FT incidentally has produced on. A colleague of mine had an article published. Thank you. And the UK government for once is ahead of you guys because our procurement bill has limited the ability of Quectel and Fibercom, which ought to be household names, from our supply chains, government supply chains. So my question is, to what degree is the Hill and your administration aware of the cellular IoT module problem, and what measures are you preparing to deal with it? Because sadly, the NDA yesterday didn't do anything for it.
Well, as the author of the IoT, cyber hygiene basic bill, I'm relatively aware, but I'm frankly probably not as aware as I should be. And I do think, the Brits are ahead of us in a number of areas. I think on this piece of supply chain, I met with your folks who are doing the, standing up the new entity inside, I believe, an agency on the kids' online safety, and that whole debate about, taking on actions that may not even be illegal, but still could be problematic. It's like, I'm going to be watching that very closely. And since I got a daughter in London, I try to use every excuse possible to go back over. But I do think, and I think it's easier for the kind of administration, regardless of party, to have a little bit of humility to think that there are things we can learn from the balance of the world. That's sometimes a little bit harder for American politicians.
We have time to, let's see, was there one final question right here?
Hi, Nicole Connor. I'm from Airbus Ventures. Many of the technologies that you have noted as being critical for this competitiveness against the authoritarian regimes are, quite frankly, within the startup community right now. And what we have seen is an interest, I think, by many of the agencies in working with the startups, but still having a lot of impediments to getting that technology into the right hands within the administration. But just love for you to comment.
Yeah, great final question. I say this as a former venture capitalist. And two or three comments. One, to represent Virginia, we've got a relatively robust startup community, but we've got lots of small contractors. And remember when I first got this job 14 years ago, I was going to fix DoD procurement. And, and the friend who was then deputy secretary brought over, all the procurement people and the volumes. And, I got worn out after a short period of time. And I think, I would argue self-servingly that on the IC side of the house, not something that I started, that Incutel does as good a job as any entity. DIUX on the defense side and some of the other defense, the record is not nearly as good. Now, what I have some optimism about is I have this, kind of wearing my new definition of national security that includes this technology competition, in terms of traditional tools, but also in these domains that you wouldn't even thought of national security. I've put together recently a group of private sector funders that go from early stage to PE. We started with 8 or 9. And, we're now trying to talk about this kind of coalition of the willing. And I would point out, Incutel's got offices in London and Sydney at this point, and there are a lot of European governments that want to weigh in and either into Incutel or into, set up their own entities. So I think on the funding, because we talk every year about the startup valley of death, and nothing ever happens in the DoD process. What I hope is that we can do is at least informally assemble a coalition of the willing to that would evaluate some level of risk profile that are interested in this sector. And I would say we're closing up, but on a positive note, some of the same PE firms that would not even meet with us to hear the challenge around China have now got religion. So the notion that you can be, be a smart investor, make a good return, and also protect national security, I think is much better today. You're not going to have, the Googles walk away from Maven anymore. So I think there is a moment in time here, but we need the funders to work with those of us who are interested in this subject in Congress to come with a really, specific set of recommendations so we can, we can bake it in. And my, again, offer to everyone here is, I think at least as long as I'm chair, the IC can be the point of the spear. It's easier to get some of these changes into the IC procurement process, and we spend tens and tens and tens of billions of dollars than maybe it is in DoD. So I'm actually relatively optimistic on this.
Okay, well, Senator, I want to thank you. Thank everybody in the audience. So I'm taking away that the narrative about where we are has changed, and that's good. There's bipartisan buy-in to thinking about the world in a different way, China, AI, but we're still too incremental, and we need some bigger picture thinking. Karen, I'm going to turn it back to you for final comments.
I just want to ask everyone to join me in thanking Chairman Warner, Rana, for just doing a masterful job of laying out these issues and the challenges in front of us and the opportunities. And also thank you to Chairman Warner's team and the GMF team who put this all together. Really appreciate it. And please tune in to what GMF is doing, because I think especially these issues that you've both raised about the kinds of institutions we need to move from the whack-a-mole. Maybe we're going from an old globalization model to a multilateral system, but different from the old one. We're going to be doing a lot of work on that. And so stay tuned. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.